Back in 2006, I had the opportunity to spend time with a woman who was gravely ill. Her body was frail, worn down by 90 years of life, carrying multiple complications that had accumulated with age. She suffered from internal problems. Her organs were failing one after another, and her body had quietly reached the point of surrender. It was clear that nature had spoken. Her physical journey was nearly over. And yet, what struck me most was not her condition, but her spirit. Her mood was astonishingly high, almost radiant, as if she were celebrating something invisible to the rest of us. She kept repeating how happy she felt. For someone in her state, lying there with a body that had already given up, this joy seemed almost impossible. But when I asked her why, she gave me an answer that left me speechless. She said her husband had come for her, and that he was ready to take her with him. This revelation was extraordinary because her husband had died many years earlier. She spoke of him with a tenderness that revealed how deep their bond had been. During their life together, he had adored her, utterly and without reservation. To him, she had been his entire world. When he passed away from natural causes, the sorrow had been overwhelming, both for her and for everyone who knew them. She had loved him just as fiercely. And now, she explained, the reason for her happiness was that, since the day before, she had been seeing him again. Her words carried conviction. When I asked her how he appeared, she didn't hesitate. "Radiant," she said. "Radiant." She described him in vivid detail. In life, his final years had been marked by suffering. He had endured several painful conditions, endured multiple surgeries, and in the end had wasted away until he was little more than skin and bones. His face had been partially paralyzed, his speech and movements broken, his body in constant decline. His death had been an ugly one, full of hardship, but what she saw now was completely different. In her hospital room, standing by the doorway, was the man she had loved, looking healthy, elegant, and strong. He was wearing his gray suit, the one reserved for parties and celebrations, along with a neat tie and a boutonniere on his lapel. His hair was perfectly combed, his smile was bright, and his presence filled her with peace. He looked as though he had come straight from a celebration to stand by her side. Of course, no one else in the room could see him. To everyone else, the doorway was empty. But for her, it was alive with his presence. And this, more than anything else, explained the serenity and happiness that lit her face. Shortly before I left, she looked at me with gratitude in her eyes. With a calm voice, she said, "Young man, thank you for coming. Believe me, I'm leaving now." That very night, she passed away, peacefully, without fear, without struggle, without the confusion that heavy medication can bring. She had been lucid to the very end, her reasoning clear, her memory sharp. Nothing clouded her mind. Her final hours were marked by clarity, calmness, and a mysterious sense of companionship. I never saw what she claimed to see. I cannot confirm her vision, but her story left a mark on me. It made me wonder whether, when our time comes to depart, those we have loved most return to us. Perhaps they appear so that we do not walk that last road alone, so that our departure is not filled with fear, sorrow, and solitude, but becomes instead a journey made in the company of those who once gave our lives meaning. This time, the story takes us to Santiago de Chile, very close to the Casa de la Moneda, the country's presidential palace. The events occurred back in the 1990s. A young woman had just landed a job in an old building located only a few steps from this historic site. The building itself had been standing for decades, at least half a century, and carried with it the atmosphere of another era. It was a grand structure rising 13 floors high with large rented offices that still preserved many of the features of the past. Polished wooden floors, stained glass panels surrounding some of the workspaces, and the kind of architecture that immediately made you feel you were stepping into another time. Beautiful, yes, but also intimidating. The girl went through the standard hiring process. The boss interviewed her several times, tested her with a trial week, and found her performance more than satisfactory. she continued training, and everything seemed perfect. Her position, however, was unusual. Normally, she would work from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m., but depending on the office's needs, she could also be required to cover a different schedule, arriving at 11 a.m. and staying until 8 p.m. Someone had to be there to attend to visitors, and the employees took turns on these extended shifts. Soon after she began, her boss announced that he would be leaving for vacation, and the responsibility of covering the long day, from 9 in the morning until 8 at night, would fall on her. It was demanding, but not unexpected. They had discussed this possibility from the beginning. Still, the girl couldn't shake a certain uneasiness about the building. It wasn't just its age, it was the energy it carried. Since childhood, she had been sensitive to things others could not see, but she had been taught to remain silent about it. When she once confided in her mother warned her never to speak about such matters again. At school, the nuns were even harsher, saying that people who saw ghosts were either insane or possessed. And if they were insane, they belonged in an asylum. If they were possessed, they were destined for hell. As a result, she grew up repressing her gift, refusing to speak about the things she perceived, but never truly able to stop perceiving them. From the very first day she set foot in the building, she felt that something was off. Her first impression was the broken elevator, forcing her to climb the stairs. On her way up, as she passed the 5th floor, she suddenly noticed the temperature change. A chill ran through her body, accompanied by the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Turning back, she glimpsed what seemed to be someone walking down the corridor. The figure was indistinct, but the impression was clear. Someone, or something, was there. Uneasy, she quickened her steps, finally reaching her office. The interviews, the hiring, the early training, all had gone well. But it wasn't until her first evening covering the extended shift, alone in the office, that the strangeness revealed itself in full. At first, it was small things, the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway when no one else was there, the creak of a door opening and closing with no one behind it. Each time she investigated, she found the rooms empty. Returning to her desk, she tried to ignore it, focusing on her work. But then her eyes caught something. A chair on the far side of the office moving ever so slightly. The office wasn't large, but it contained several desks. It wasn't just her and her boss who worked there. Multiple workstations filled the room. And now, one of the chairs, an old, heavy-wheeled office chair, began to shift. At first, it rocked gently, but soon the motion became stronger, as if someone invisible were sitting there, rocking back and forth with increasing force. Her nerves spiked, and before she could react, another phenomenon occurred. Behind her, one of the upper drawers slid open by itself. She turned her head, startled, only for her own desk drawer to suddenly fly open and slam shut violently. A cold hand seemed to brush against her arm. She jumped, terrified. Yet when she spun around, there was no one there. That was enough. She grabbed her bag and fled, leaving the lights on, the air conditioning running, the door ajar. She didn't stop running until she reached home. The next morning, when she returned, the consequences awaited her. Someone had arrived before her and reported the state in which she had left everything. She received a stern scolding. Embarrassed, she confessed what had happened, admitting that she had been frightened out of her wits. Oddly, her explanation seemed to resonate with at least one of the supervisors. A senior manager, well above her in rank, took her aside. The young woman explained everything she had experienced. Rather than ridicule her, the manager simply told her not to worry. She promised that, for at least the following week, while the extended schedule continued, she herself would accompany her so she wouldn't be alone. True to her word, the manager stayed. During that week, the two of them worked side by side. Even so, they both heard the unexplained noises. Footsteps after everyone else had left at 6, faint movements in the empty hallways. But together, the burden was lighter. When the week ended, however, the young woman was alone again, and the disturbances returned with greater intensity. Upon his return from vacation, the boss listened carefully as she recounted her experiences, horrified. To her surprise, he nodded and said, "I believe you. Don't worry, I believe you." He explained that strange occurrences had always been part of that building. He had been working there for years and had seen and heard enough to know it wasn't her imagination. He even gave her advice. "When the noises start, speak up. Raise your voice and tell them, 'Don't bother me.' Shout at them, curse if you have to. Then say, 'I'll be here until this hour, and then I'll leave, so let me work in peace.'" She followed his instructions, and, to her astonishment, it worked. Whenever the sounds began, she would firmly announce her presence, demand to be left alone, and set her departure time, and the disturbances lessened. But there was a catch. The spirits seemed to keep track of her promises. If she declared she would leave at 8 p.m., everything remained quiet until exactly that time. But if she stayed past her announced departure, even by just a few minutes, the phenomena erupted with force. Objects moving, drawers slamming, the chilling sensation of being touched. Once she even felt her hair yanked and her chair pushed, as if unseen hands were reminding her that she had overstayed her welcome. The presence in the building wasn't just limited to her, though. A shadow often appeared, always at the edge of vision. Sometimes she would turn her head and see it standing there. Other times, colleagues glimpsed it as well. Even her boss admitted to noticing it on several occasions. Once, while walking through the hallway, they both witnessed movement inside a locked office. A figure pacing back and forth, though the room was securely closed and known to be empty. On another morning, she arrived early and passed by a manager's cubicle. There, she saw the man kneeling in prayer, dressed in gray trousers and a white shirt. The sight wasn't unusual. He was a devout, practicing Jew, and prayer was part of his routine. Respecting his devotion, she didn't greet him or interrupt. Later, however, when she mentioned it, others told her the manager had not arrived yet. In fact, he didn't enter the office until much later. When she confronted him, he assured her, "You couldn't have seen me. I wasn't here at all this morning." The manifestations, though frightening, weren't always violent. Once she established boundaries, such as announcing her departure time, they generally respected her. But not everyone was treated the same. One noisy coworker who constantly shouted and sang in the office was harassed relentlessly. Objects were thrown at him, he was shoved, even pulled from his chair. Eventually, he quit. After 3 years, the company relocated to a modern building, leaving the old one behind. On her last day, the young woman asked the elderly guards and janitors if they had ever seen anything strange there. Slowly, they opened up. They revealed that during the coup d'etat of 1973, the building had been forcibly evacuated by soldiers. No one ever knew what became of the people, men and women, who were taken away. In the years since, offices had often been abandoned suddenly, with belongings left behind, especially on the 5th and 6th floors. Employees would resign, tenants would flee, unable to endure the oppressive atmosphere. Were these the lingering spirits of those who never returned? Residual imprints of violence, or conscious presences trapped in that space? The girl never found the answer. All she knew was that in that building, the unseen was very real, and it responded when spoken to. In 1988, my family, my father, my mother, my younger sister, and I, moved to a neighborhood in San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico, called Santurce. After searching for some time, we found a large old house near the University of the Sacred Heart. The place had history written all over it, an Art Deco structure that was easily 80, perhaps even 100 years old. When we first arrived, the house needed cleaning and repairs. We all worked together as a family to make it livable. As we cleared out old corners and forgotten furniture, we discovered something strange. Inside some of the clay pots scattered around the property, we found chains like the ones people wear as jewelry, gold necklaces tangled and hidden inside the dirt. From that moment on, the atmosphere of the house seemed to shift. It began with whispers. At night, I started hearing voices in my room. I was only 14, maybe 15 at the time, and I often wondered if my imagination or my hormones were playing tricks on me. But the sensations were too real to ignore. The closet hangers swayed as though invisible fingers were brushing against them. The air felt heavy, and the once lively house grew darker with every passing day. I frequently heard people calling my name. Back then, there were no cell phones, no beepers, so friends who wanted to see me would simply stand outside the house and call out, "Jose." It was common for me to rush outside, only to find no one there. The phenomena escalated. One night while sleeping, I was startled awake by the sound of heavy breathing right next to me. It wasn't faint or subtle. It was deep, powerful, and terrifying, as though someone was standing inches away from my bed. Another time, I woke up to see a white figure floating near the ceiling of my room. The house had 2 floors. The ground floor was used as the office space for my father's business, while the second floor was our living area. When my father changed jobs, the office downstairs was left empty. We began to use that space for gatherings and board games. It had tables, desks, and plenty of chairs, so it became a comfortable place for us and our friends. It wasn't long before others started to notice things too. My parents once told me, almost casually, that there seemed to be someone else in the house with us. Friends who visited also began to mention unsettling encounters. One saw a woman in the kitchen, holding a cup as though she had just stepped in from another time. Another friend described seeing figures moving from room to room as if they lived there alongside us. The most chilling moment, however, came years later, around 1996 or 1997. I was outside with 2 friends. One had already gotten into his car and was turning on the engine, while I stood in the driveway talking with another friend behind me. As I turned to say something, I froze. Standing at the corner of the garage was an elderly man, dressed in white, a guayabera shirt, matching trousers, and a wide-brimmed hat. His presence was solid, undeniable. I turned my head forward again, startled by the suddenness of what I had seen. My friend noticed my reaction and instinctively glanced behind him. He saw the man, too. In that instant, the figure transformed. The solid elderly man in white collapsed into a black shadow, dissolving with unnatural speed, and darted into the house through the front door. Panic set in. I bolted inside, shouting for my sister, who was still in the house. My 2 friends followed me, and together we searched every room. But of course, we found nothing. Later, I would realize that others had seen him as well. That same friend, who had been in the bathroom with me once, told me he had just seen a man in a guayabera. His face had drained of color when he described the figure, the very same one my friend Tony and I had seen before. It was not imagination. Whatever lived in that house, we weren't facing it alone. Over time, the strange events in the house did not cease. They changed in intensity, sometimes calming down, sometimes returning with force. One of the most unsettling moments came from a close friend who had already witnessed the man in the guayabera. One day, I was in the bathroom, which had a peculiar design. Because of how it was built, one could step inside, leave the door slightly open, and still have privacy. This same friend had come by to pick me up. We were heading out. While I was inside, he stood in the doorway talking to me. At one point, he said, "I'm going to get some water, Jose," and turned away. Suddenly, I heard him gasp as though startled by something. I rushed out and asked what had happened. Pale and shaken, he said he had just seen a man. I pressed him for details, and he described him. A man in a guayabera, dressed in white. His description matched exactly the figure Tony and I had seen before. The fear was real, not just for me, but for anyone who crossed paths with that presence. As time passed, the intensity of these encounters ebbed slightly, but the sense of a lingering presence never fully disappeared. Eventually, I learned something about the history of the place from a neighbor who had lived across the street for many years. He told me that long ago the house had belonged to a woman who practiced Santeria and was also a palera. Suddenly, the strange objects we had found when we moved in, the chains tied and hidden in pots, made sense. At the time, I hadn't understood their meaning. But now, it seemed clear. Despite this knowledge, life continued in the house. Strange occurrences remained part of daily existence, like an invisible roommate that none of us had invited but all had learned to tolerate. Years later, I moved into a small apartment built in the back of the same property. My ex-partner also experienced something terrifying in that house. At the time, we ran a small translation business, and she often worked in an upstairs office. One evening, I was lying in bed with a stomach illness, drowsy and half asleep, when she suddenly appeared in the room. She lay beside me, staring intently. Her expression was troubled. When I asked what was wrong, she confessed she could no longer work in that office. Someone, she said, had leaned close and blown into her ear while she was sitting at her desk. The fear was so strong that she gathered her things and refused to ever enter that office again. From then on, she worked from her own house. Later, my grandmother came to live with us. She spent the last 10 years of her life in that house. Eventually, she passed away, though not in the house itself. She died at the home of a distant cousin. But only a few days after her death, something happened that still haunts me. That night, after a friend dropped me off, I went inside and headed to the downstairs bathroom. The mesh screen covering the window had been pushed inward, as though someone had forced it. Next to that window stood a wicker cabinet filled with my grandmother's medications. She had been elderly and ill, so the drawers overflowed with pills and bottles. But that night, the cabinet was destroyed. The doors and drawers had burst open violently, and all of its contents had been hurled across the room, spilling into the hallway, even reaching the living room. It looked as if an explosion had gone off. The house was tall, the ceilings high. I am 6 feet tall, about 180 centimeters, and even stretching, I could barely reach that bathroom window. Yet the cabinet stood farther back. I couldn't understand how anything physical could have caused that destruction. Shaken, I walked toward the kitchen for a glass of water. But there, another shock awaited me. The kitchen window, which was even higher than the bathrooms, had also been disturbed. Everything that had been around the sink, the dishes, utensils, and small objects, was scattered across the floor. That night, I didn't sleep downstairs. The last straw came when I was awakened in my bedroom by the feeling of someone shaking my shoulder. It wasn't a vague sensation. I felt a hand gripping me, rocking me back and forth to wake me. Annoyed, I opened my eyes ready to scold whoever it was. But when I looked up, I saw nothing except a black shadow darting into the bathroom, vanishing like smoke. That night, I didn't close my eyes again. Eventually, I decided to move out of the house and into a nearby apartment. But even there, the disturbances followed. The nights became difficult once again. Hoping for some comfort, I adopted a small dog, and strangely, the presence seemed to diminish. But not completely. One night, the familiar sensation returned. I felt someone pushing me, urging me to wake up. When I opened my eyes, I saw the shadow again. This time, instead of fleeing into another room, it slipped inside a suitcase I kept in the corner. That suitcase had been given to me by a friend who worked in maintenance, where people often discarded old but usable items. He had given me the suitcase to store odds and ends, and I had been using it without issue. But after seeing the shadow crawl inside it, I couldn't keep it any longer. I emptied the suitcase of everything, threw it out, and never experienced another disturbance in that apartment again. Even after I moved into the apartment at the back of the property, the sense of being watched never fully left me. There were moments when I would step into the main house and feel as though something unseen was pressing in on me. Eventually, I began piecing together fragments of its past, and what I discovered made the atmosphere even heavier. The house, I learned, had once belonged to an elderly woman who died alone. Her children had not been with her in her final days. In fact, no one realized she had passed away until days later. By then, in the hot and humid climate of Puerto Rico, her body had begun to decompose. The scene her children encountered when they finally entered the house was grotesque, tragic, and unforgettable. One evening, long after I had moved in, I was speaking casually with a friend who knew nothing about the house's history. Out of nowhere, she grew quiet and said, "There is a woman here. She walks through this house crying, drinking her own tears because she feels so alone. Her words chilled me to the bone. I had never told her anything about the former owner, never mentioned the loneliness of her death. How could she have known? She explained that she sometimes had visions, that she was a little bit of a witch, and that she could see or feel things most people could not. Whether coincidence or not, her words matched perfectly with what I had learned. As time passed, the manifestations in the house became more sporadic, but they never disappeared entirely. My parents eventually admitted that they too had seen things. Shadows, strange movements, whispers, but like me, they had stayed quiet, each assuming it was just imagination. Only later, when the disturbances became too obvious to ignore, did we begin comparing our experiences and realize how much had truly been happening. At my mother's request, a priest was brought in to bless the house. He sprinkled holy water, prayed in each room, and invoked peace upon the walls that had seen so much. From that day, the intensity of the events diminished noticeably. Still, one night stands out as one of the most terrifying of my life. My parents owned a small Yorkie dog that slept in their bed. Whenever they traveled, the dog would become restless, unable to relax unless someone stayed in their room. So they asked me to sleep there whenever they were away. At around 3 a.m, I was jolted awake by a sound unlike anything I had ever heard. It was a scream. Long, guttural, agonizing, as if a woman were being torn apart from the inside. The cry lasted more than a minute, maybe 2, long enough for me to sit upright in bed, heart pounding, and realize it was no dream. The sound came from just outside the window of my parents' room. What made it worse was the dog's reaction, or rather, the lack of one. Normally, she barked at the smallest noise, but this time she lay completely still beside me, limp and unresponsive, as if drugged or lifeless. I touched her, expecting tension, but she was completely relaxed, lost in unnatural sleep. The scream shook the room, and yet the dog never moved. I never slept in that room again. The memory of that scream haunted me for years, a sound too raw, too human to be forgotten. That was my story, the story of the house that never seemed to let go of its past, a place where death, loneliness, and sorrow had carved themselves into the walls, a place where even prayers could only quiet the shadows, not banish them completely. The next story takes us back to 2004. A young girl named Nati began high school, and there she met a boy named Manuel. From the very beginning, they connected and became close friends. Nothing more than that. Just friends. Manuel wasn't the type to be outgoing or to tell jokes. He was serious, calm, always collected. But in that seriousness, there was strength. He was dependable. The kind of person who, if something went wrong, always knew what to do. He was steady, stoic, the kind of friend you could lean on. And so, a genuine friendship blossomed between Nati and Manuel during those years. When high school ended, life moved on. Years passed without much contact between them. In 2011, however, Nati reconnected with Manuel through Facebook. By then, she was preparing for one of the happiest moments of her life, her wedding to the man she considered the love of her life. Hoping to share the joy with her old friend, she reached out, invited him to the wedding, and was delighted when he responded. Unfortunately, he told her he couldn't attend. His work was consuming him, an oppressive job that left him no freedom. Nati, always caring, even advised him, "You should leave that job. Find something better, something that allows you to have a girlfriend, a life, a future." Manuel promised to think about it, but at that moment the job had him trapped. Even though he couldn't attend the wedding, the contact between them was re-established. They began exchanging occasional messages, keeping in touch. In 2018, when Nati gave birth to her first daughter, Manuel called her personally to congratulate her. It was July of that year, and the conversation was full of joy, laughter, and warmth. He continued messaging her, celebrating the milestone with her, showing the same kindness and steadiness he had always had as a friend. But behind those conversations, his life had not improved. He was still stuck in the same suffocating job that drained all his energy and time. And then, on August 6, 2018, everything changed. That day, Nati received a message from a friend. The words were devastating. "Manuel is dead." At first, she refused to believe it. How could he be dead? They had spoken just days earlier, exchanged messages, shared laughs. But the news was true. Shocked, she went to Facebook, and there it was, the unmistakable sign of mourning, a black ribbon on his profile posted by his family. At first, she thought it must have been an accident, maybe at work, or perhaps a car crash. But then she learned the truth. Manuel had taken his own life. He had ended it himself. Nati was crushed. Despite her happy life, a loving husband, a newborn daughter, grief overwhelmed her. She had lost one of the most important friends of her youth, and the loss felt unbearable. That was when the dreams began. The first one came suddenly. In it, she found herself face to face with Manuel. But something about him was different. His face had changed, distorted, and it filled her with fear. In the dream, she asked him, "Why are you here? You're dead. What are you doing here?" He didn't answer. His silence and that unsettling gaze filled her with dread. She woke up in terror, only to feel, with absolute clarity, the weight of someone lying next to her in bed. But she was alone. That night, her husband hadn't been home. He had returned only at dawn, and yet she felt the pressure of a body beside her, the undeniable sensation of not being alone. The dreams continued, and with them, the fear. Each time Manuel appeared, she felt her stomach tighten with dread. His presence was vivid, too real. Unlike ordinary dreams that shift and fade, these encounters were stable, precise, as though she were standing face to face with him in waking life. In one dream, she summoned the courage to speak. "Why are you here? Why haven't you left?" His response chilled her. "Are you afraid of me?" "Yes," she admitted. "I am afraid. Afraid to see you. Afraid that you are here." Then he said, "If you are afraid, I will not come any more. I will only return if you call me." And just like that, the dreams stopped. For a time, she was free of them. Years passed. In 2020, while organizing old photographs, Nati stumbled upon some pictures from high school. There he was, Manuel. Smiling, alive, young. She felt warmth in her heart, a bittersweet happiness at the memory. Later, she found an old video on her computer, and again she saw him. The nostalgia, mixed with the memories of those strange dreams, brought him back into her thoughts. That very night, Manuel returned. In the dream, he was no longer twisted or frightening. He appeared radiant, healthy, smiling as he had never been before. Nati ran to him and wrapped him in a powerful embrace. To her astonishment, she felt it, the warmth, the solidity of his body. It was not like a dream at all. It was a contact, as real as any moment in life. When she let him go, she asked what had happened. And Manuel confessed, "I was diagnosed with an illness. I had a girlfriend, but my sickness would have never allowed me to be with her. I thought, why keep going like this? That's why I ended it. But now, I regret it so much." In the dream, Nati counseled him. "You must ask for forgiveness. Truly, ask for it. I will help you in whatever way I can." The next morning, she lit a candle in his memory, placed a white flower beside it, and set a picture of him nearby. She prayed for his rest, hoping to guide him toward the light. After that, she never dreamed of him again. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that those dreams had been more than imagination. They had been visits, messages from a friend caught between worlds, filled with regret and seeking peace. Dreams like these are often called contact dreams. They are vivid, consistent, with details too precise to be dismissed. In some of them, Nati described Manuel as dirty, sad, and weighed down by despair, as though reflecting the torment of his decision. And yet, through the bond of friendship, he had found a way to reach her, to express his sorrow, and perhaps, through her prayers, find some measure of redemption. The next case is darker, filled with pain, betrayal, and a promise that lingered even beyond death. It is the story of Tonio. Tonio was a violent man, an alcoholic, abusive and careless with everyone around him. One day, in a fit of selfishness, he sold his own mother's house, without asking her, without even warning her. The shock, the grief, and the despair were too much for the elderly woman. The weight of that betrayal crushed her, and the emotional blow led to a catastrophic decline in her health. Not long after, she suffered a collapse that left her completely paralyzed. Tonio, as reckless as ever, simply disappeared. He continued his dissolute life of drinking and wandering, never looking back, never taking responsibility. His mother, now a quadriplegic, had to be cared for by her daughter-in-law, the wife of one of Tonio's brothers. This woman took on the burden of tending to her every need, feeding her by hand, turning her in bed, cleaning her, watching over her day and night. Life was difficult, but stable until Tonio's own path caught up with him. His years of abuse and excess ended the way everyone had feared. He died of cirrhosis, consumed by alcohol. Even in death, however, Tonio was not done tormenting the family. One night, while his daughter-in-law was working her shift at the hospital, she was a nurse. The family called in a panic. Something was happening at the house. She rushed home to find the grandmother in a terrible state. The old woman was trembling, trying desperately to move, crawling in her bed despite her paralysis. Her eyes were wide with terror, her voice hoarse and broken as she repeated one word again and again. "Tonio. Tonio." Her hand pointed to a corner of the room. Though no one else could see it, she insisted he was there. The shock was too much. The grandmother's health collapsed further, and she was rushed to the hospital. There, the episodes continued. She would cover her face with her frail hands, crying out "Tonio" in fear, as if hiding from something only she could see. Her daughter-in-law, exhausted from long nights of work, stayed with her constantly. One morning, after a particularly hard shift, she sat at the foot of the hospital bed and drifted into a brief, restless sleep. Suddenly, she woke with the sensation of someone gently pushing her back down, preventing her from rising. Unable to move, she turned her head slightly and saw something that left her frozen. Several figures were standing around the bed. They looked like doctors, dressed in white coats, surrounding the old woman as if examining her. But there was something strange. Their faces were familiar. They weren't strangers at all. They were family members who had already passed away. Her father-in-law, uncles, and others long gone. All of them seemed to be there, accompanying the grandmother in her final moments. But among them, Tonio was absent. Moments later, the old woman died. The nurse rushed to fetch the on-duty staff, asking if doctors had come into the room. The nurse on shift shook her head. "No one came. Only you have been here." And then the daughter-in-law realized something even stranger. The bed had been pushed up against the wall. There had been no room for anyone to stand around it, and yet she had clearly seen them surrounding her. She remembered Tonio's words from long ago, drunken promises he had once hurled at his mother. "When I die, I'll come back for you." And it seemed that he had indeed returned, terrifying her in her last days. But what he had not counted on was that others, the family members who truly loved her, would also come. They had arrived to escort her, to protect her, to make sure that her departure was not into his hands alone. In the end, Tonio had kept his cruel vow, but the strength of love outweighed the malice. Surrounded by those who had cherished her, the grandmother found her way into death accompanied, not alone. Stories like these remind us that the boundary between life and death is far thinner than we often believe. From hospital rooms where loved ones return dressed in light, to haunted offices echoing with the steps of those who never left, to family homes filled with the weight of unspoken tragedies, again and again we find the same truth. The past is never truly gone. In Santiago de Chile, the young woman discovered that the shadows of violence and loss can linger for decades, bound to a place by memories too strong to fade. In Puerto Rico, an old house in Santurce revealed how the practices of the past and the loneliness of forgotten souls can cling to a family, demanding to be seen. Nati, as Dreams of Manuel, reminded us that friendship is a bond that even death cannot easily break, and sometimes the dead return, not to frighten us, but to seek forgiveness. And in the story of Tonio, we saw how cruelty can echo beyond the grave, but also how love, stronger, brighter, can prevail even in the final moments of life. Perhaps these are only stories, fragments of imagination, the product of memory and fear. Or perhaps they are something more, glimpses of what awaits us, reminders that death is not always a lonely path. That sometimes, when the hour arrives, those who walked with us in life may return, not to scare us, but to guide us home.